This is my agenda for today. So first I'll cover my motivation for joining this conference here and writing the paper. Then I'll talk about the contested form of conduct of the maneuver and maneuver warfare overall. Then I'll continue to discuss the maneuver in theory. I'll get to some practical examples of wars in Ukraine and Gaza. And then I'll conclude and propose that maneuver is still maybe or maybe not a key method for an optional warfare today. So first, let's break down my motivation. It's not an every day to see a cadet talking in front of and holding a presentation to colonels and even generals. So first of all, it's a great honor, a great opportunity for me, and thank you all for that. Jokes aside, so how did I get here? There was a letter of invitation sent to the Croatian Defense Academy and to the Cadet Battalion too. So one morning I was invited by my company commander to get to his office, and he suggested that I should write a paper. Once that I had seen the main question of the conference, is maneuver dead? I was immediately triggered, and I knew that I had to say something about that. You see, my entire military training so far, these 5 years, has been all about maneuver. Excuse me. All training and classes are focused and towards maneuver warfare overall. So I haven't heard and I haven't been trained to anything else rather than maneuver. So it's everything I know, basically. Furthermore, that's even more funnier that I have completed the armor and mechanized infantry school, so where would you find more emphasis on maneuver than there? Also, at the Croatian Defense Academy, we are exposed to the experience from the Croatian Homeland War. There are many officers and NCOs which are still holding classes to us, and they always bolster some experience from the Croatian Homeland War during the 90s, especially during the 1995, when Operation Storm happened, the operation where we liberated most of our occupied territory, and it was a pure example of maneuver. So a question came to my mind, how can anybody question a concept so dear to me, so dear to us as a nation and to us as an alliance, which is a maneuver. Therefore, the main motivation is to defend the relevance of maneuver in front of you, and to maybe express how it would be premature to pronounce maneuver dead, or maybe even dangerous to do so. Then I started digging a bit more, and I found that many critics claim that the rapid technological advance, especially in intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance, has rendered maneuver easy to detect. Sorry about the error. Furthermore, most of the world's population, as we have heard yesterday from the general's speech, resides in an urban environment. Therefore, maneuver must be relevant since urban environments channelize our forces. The war in Ukraine is an obvious example of war attrition, so maneuver is obsolete. We do not need it anymore. So many critics argue that the maneuver is dead. So then I went to the theory to see what the theory says about maneuver warfare, and maneuver's approach. And then I found that the maneuver, which is defined in the NATO doctrine as the following, is deployment of forces on the battlefield through movement in combination with fire or fire potential to achieve a position of advantage in respect to the enemy in order to accomplish the mission. Again, this is the NATO's definition of maneuver. Bear in mind that this is maneuver, not maneuver warfare. The second important approach, or philosophy if you wish, is maneuver's approach, which is defined as a philosophy which focuses on destroying the enemy's will to fight rather than the enemy's physical forces, which we have encountered so many times during this conference already. It correlates to the Sun Tzu theory. For example, he claimed that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. So how do we do it? We do it by seizing and exploiting the initiative, by targeting enemy's will to fight and bringing chaos among his ranks. It would be impossible to do it without applying mission command, which is a core NATO's philosophy, as you already know. And it stands opposed to the detailed command, which I'll talk about soon. Then I went to apply these concepts from the theory to maybe more practical examples. The first one is the actual current war in Ukraine. So first, let me tell something about the mission command in Ukraine. According to many authors, it is one of the reasons for the initial success against a materially stronger enemy during the initial phases of the invasion. It stands opposed to the detailed command, which is a Soviet legacy, still employed by the Russian forces mostly. Detailed command entails direct input from the commanders, which renders the lower echelon commanders especially practically inert to ever-changing combat, the ever-changing situation on the battlefield. The mission command in Ukraine was employed since 2014. Then the Ukrainian armed forces started cooperating with Western allies, predominantly United States, and they were trained at least basically what mission command is and how to apply it in modern combat. Former Ukrainian commander-in-chief General Zaluzhny was a strong advocate of the mission command, and he promoted it among every line of command. The Royal United Services Institute described the Ukrainian armed forces are very competitive against their adversaries, not because of superior equipment in the early phases of the war, but because they were adaptable, especially at the tactical level, and rapidly innovated new capabilities and concepts of employment to address specific areas of vulnerability where the Russians had achieved overmuch. Overall, this statement witnesses that the Ukrainians employed at least some amount of mission command during the initial phases of the war. However, there is one major problem today, and even then so, is that the senior leadership of the Ukrainian armed forces still exercise detailed command since they were trained in the Soviet Union, and they still have strong tradition and strong influence above the detailed command. I'm sorry. However, this example shows that the Ukraine has great potential to deploy mission command further, or at least it had some at the beginning of the invasion. On this map, you can see the initial phases of the invasion and initial territorial gains made by the Russians. So, in the next few slides, I'm going to try to explain the importance of maneuver, which I'll try to prove through the war in Ukraine. So the initial phase of war was pure war of maneuver. We saw rapid mobile operations aimed at achieving swift and decisive victories, which were employed by Russians. The most probably relevant example is the Hostomel Zult. It is a tactical maneuver with possible strategic consequences that was already discussed here. Who can tell what would have happened had this assault was successful? However, it was not. It failed due to the poor planning and poor execution. It would be fun to ask ourselves, had the assault been successful, would be here still discussing the relevance of maneuver in such great, in such a great way. Furthermore, Ukraine employed defense in-depth strategy and mobile defense in the later phases, transitioning to the offense, which is again an example of maneuver. Bear in mind, I'm talking about maneuver, not maneuver warfare, maneuverist approach. Furthermore, it is important to know that the Russians failed to adhere to the basic principles of maneuver warfare later in the conflict. They didn't employ effective use of combined arms at all. They didn't employ the centralized command, as we have heard today. It doesn't even exist in their vocabulary. They didn't employ quick or disciplined decision-making, particularly at the lower levels of command. And they lacked the exploitation of the initial success, which they gained in the initial phases of the invasion. Among these factors are some that, in my opinion, helped to transfer the war from the maneuverist phase to the war of attrition. Among some of these factors are logistical challenges. The Russians were simply overstretched, as we have heard yesterday. The war has seen excessive drone usage, which renders maneuver very hard to employ. For example, it is when a grouping of forces happens, it is easily to spot it with drones. To prove that the drone usage is extensive, I found data that Ukraine is losing at least 10,000 drones a month. This number can be even higher now. The data is from 2023. Local counterattacks also promoted the transfer from the maneuvers to to attritional phase, since it slowed down Russia's more and it slowed their operational tempo. Fortified urban and rural centers, which were fortified, of course, but the Ukraine slowed Russian even more. International support provided to the Ukrainian slowed Russia again. Morale, which is a highly debated topic regarding among the Russian ranks. There are many reports witnessing that Russian morale is very low. However, it may be true for the conscripts, but there is no real relevant data for professional military units. At least I haven't found any. If you have any different pieces of information, I'll be happy to hear it in the Q&A afterwards. And unclear strategic goals, of course. It can be debated too. However, Putin said that his goal is denazifying Ukraine. In my opinion, it is hard to measure how much is Ukraine nazified or denazified. So when is the point that you say Ukraine is denazified now, so I'll stop my invasion right now? You can say that it's a regime change, that his goal is to change the regime. However, I doubt that the invasion will stop tomorrow if Zelensky and his entire cabinet resign today. So it's at least a bit sketchy. Flawed decision-making at the operational and tactical levels by the Russian forces also slowed them down in the further phases of the invasion. One great problem they expressed is the tendency of false reporting at all the levels of command, which then again led to poor decision-making, and it was all just turning back and forth in circle. At the tactical level, they lack the understanding of how their actions fit into their strategic plan, which may be approved to my thesis that the Putin's end state is quite ambiguous. Another example of maneuver in the war is the Kharkiv and Kherson 2022 counteroffensives. They can be described as decisive actions. It is important to note that when conditions are set, maneuver is still relevant, and these two counteroffensives prove that. The key phrase here is conditions being set. Without setting the conditions for maneuver, it is impossible to conduct it. So the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives highlight two key factors that increase the success of offensive maneuvers on the battlefield. The first one being the effective integration of combined arms or multi-domain operations, and the second one being the concentration of forces in achieving numerical superiority in a local specific area. So maybe I am wrong, but these two counteroffensives are probably the last time we have seen these two principles applied in the war in Ukraine. Prior to the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives, Ukrainians targeted the command and control nodes, logistical centers, and other support systems, which is indeed a demonstration of maneuverist approach because they render chaos into and influence their understanding of Russians. However, we must ask ourselves, how was it achieved? Was it really achieved with maneuver or precision strikes or elite units penetrating the Russian territory, or was it achieved with mass fires? So to say attrition. So it can be really said that attrition or that maneuverist approach was achieved through attrition. So it's a fun thing to say. There we can see the real importance of attrition, and in my opinion, it is the setting the conditions for the maneuver. It actually enables the maneuver. This is the concept that we have heard yesterday too. As Gady and Kaufman say, the maneuver warfare proved successful when prolonged attrition made it easy. So I felt free to propose a claim that modern wars will most likely consist of both the maneuverist and attritional phase, just in different ratios. Maneuver will probably most likely be still responsible for decisive actions when the conditions are set, of course. But if there are no conditions set for employing the effective maneuver, then attrition must take over. That's the interesting theory that proposes and bolsters the fact that we have heard yesterday that we should train our forces in both ways of warfare, not just one. So key takeaways from the conflict, the decision-making processes and command culture can directly impact the success of military operations, as was seen especially during the initial phases. The lack of multi-domain operations, combined arms maneuver and poor command culture, have led to the extensive use of attritional warfare in the Ukrainian war. As was witnessed, maneuver still remains relevant and in heavy use. It was witnessed by the initial phases of the war and 2022 counteroffensives, and as well, I would argue, with the current ongoing incursion into Kursk. It can be debated that whether it is maneuver warfare or maneuverist approach, as was debated yesterday, but according to the NATO's definition, it definitely is maneuver. The true value of attrition, therefore, is setting the conditions, these conditions that are needed for employing effective maneuver. I will now shift to the war in Gaza and try to explain how maneuver might still be relevant in urban centers in attritional and conventional conflict, such as the war in Gaza. So you can argue that the war in Gaza is fought in mainly urban area of operations. Surprise, it contains elements of both attrition and maneuver warfare, as does the war in Ukraine. So the elements of attrition are high casualty and destruction rate, which is also an element of a war fought between conventional forces and insurgents. Blockades and isolation, which are tactics employed by IDF, and guerrilla tactics employed by Hamas in order to attrit Israeli defense forces. The elements which can be attributed to the maneuver warfare are the effort concentration by the IDF, targeting specific nodes, rapid organized movement, and adaptability to intelligence and to quickly react to the newly provided intelligence. They also employ combined arms, elite units, and modern Eastern technology, which is a concept which has not been seen so extensively in Ukraine. So to further explain the effort concentration, the IDF targets high-value targets and strategic objectives, such as the Rafah crossing and Philadelphia corridor, which are the locations where alleged weapons smuggling by Hamas happened. One example of raid on Hamad towers in Khan Yunis is an example of a precise attack aimed at destroying alleged Hamas infrastructure and strong points. It again can be debated that it's an example of maneuverist approach and maneuver warfare. However, from a strictly militarily point of view, it definitely is maneuver, and even so, maybe an operational type of maneuver, because Hamas allegedly there had the weapon factory, so it had an impact on them. The IDF showed rapid, organized, and flexible movements rather than the inert and static engagements. Furthermore, asymmetrical and unconventional conflict, which is the war in Gaza, still proves that the maneuver is possible in urban environment. And again, maneuver, not maneuver warfare, maneuverist approach. That leads us to the question, but is the maneuverist approach, does this war in Gaza bolsters the fact that the maneuverist approach is still applicable? Well, the answer to that question is I honestly don't know, and I think it would be prematurely for us to answer either yes or no. The recent or further history will show us, but in my honest opinion, I don't think that we have an answer yet to that question. This leads us to one of the final slides. So, is a maneuver still a key method? To that question, I would reply yes. So it will still be a tool for conducting decisive actions, as was witnessed during the initial phases of the war in Ukraine and Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives. Wars in Ukraine and Gaza show that it still does have relevance. In order to conduct maneuver, which is my key point, is that some certain conditions must be set. If there are no conditions such as the mass, which was discussed by the Colonel a bit before, or the concentration of the forces, maneuver simply cannot be applied. And I believe that is currently happening in Ukraine. There are no conditions on both sides which had to be checked in order to apply maneuver. So the war in Ukraine again shows that if maneuver is not possible, attrition must be employed. And the great value of attrition proves to be setting conditions for effective maneuver. So the combination of maneuver and attrition is a key, in my opinion. The modern wars will most likely entail both the maneuverist phase and the attritional phase, just in different ratios. And therefore, I would conclude that it might be important to train future officers, including myself, into both ways, both types of the waging war, not just the one. I would thank you once again for your attention and for an opportunity to speak here in front of you. If you are to have any questions, please feel free to ask during the Q&A. This concludes my briefing. Thank you.